Good morning, Mercy View. My name is Ellen. I am a partner here. This morning I will be reading from Psalm 54 and Psalm 63. These can be found on page 271 and 274 in the Bibles under your chairs. If you do not have a Bible, please feel free to take one. It is our gift to you. I will be starting in Psalm 54, verse 1. To the choir master with stringed instruments, a maskil of David, when the Zephites went and told Saul, "Is not David hiding among us?" O God, save me by your name, and vindicate me by your might. O God, hear my prayer. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers have risen against me. Ruthless men seek my life. They do not set God before themselves. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is the upholder of my life. He will return the evil to my enemies. In your faithfulness, put an end to them. With a freewill offering, I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Lord, for it is good. For he has delivered me from every trouble, and my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies. And then 64. Sorry, 63. A psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips. When I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night, for you have been my help. And in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. My soul clings to you, your right hand upholds me. But those who seek to destroy my life shall go down into the depths of the earth. They shall be given over to the power of the sword, and they shall be a portion for jackals. But the king shall rejoice in God. All who swear by him shall exult, for the mouths of liars will be stopped. This is the word of the Lord.
Praise be to God. Thank you, Ellen. Hey, good morning. Good to see you. Hello, hello. Yeah, welcome to Mercy View. If you're visiting with us this morning, honored you joined us. My name is Brad, one of the pastors here. Can you hear me? You got okay. Yeah, there we go. Hey, we're happy to have you. If you're visiting with us, if I haven't met you yet, I'd love to do that after the service this morning. One quick announcement I want to add to what Trey shared earlier. We mentioned this last week for the first time, but beginning here at the end of this month, we are actually launching a men's leadership development cohort here at Mercy View. And so the Bible calls men in particular to lead in their homes and in the church, and we have a conviction here at Mercy View to help strengthen the men among us and in this way. And so to that end, we want to invite you, if you're interested in joining the Mercy View Men's Leadership Development Cohort, to let us know at elders@mercyview.com so we can send you an application for that. It'll begin on Sunday, March the 30th through Sunday, May the 11th. We're going to skip Easter Sunday. But the elders of Mercy View will be leading this with you. And man, our heart is to strengthen you in wisdom, in your character, in your competency. So if you're interested, let us know. The elders really look forward to serving you if you're going to be a part of that. All right. I want you to listen to a couple of things here as we get started this morning. This first quote comes from probably my favorite preacher, the 19th century great Baptist preacher, Charles Spurgeon. Listen to this. He says this: "The Lord is revealed in the backside of the desert. The wilderness is the way to Canaan. The low valley leads to the towering mountain." And then listen to this. This is from also another 19th century pastor, Scottish pastor actually, by the name of George MacDonald. He says this. He says, "No words can express how much the world owes to sorrow." Most of the Psalms were born in the wilderness. This is MacDonald still. Most of the epistles were written in prison. When God is about to make preeminent use of a person, he puts them in the fire. Now, what Spurgeon and MacDonald are talking about here is that sometimes the furnace is where God does some of his best work. Or better, his best refinement. Can I be real with you this morning? Late 2021, early 2022 for me personally, but also as a pastor, was probably the hardest season for me in ministry in my time here in Tulsa. Let me take you a step before that and explain it this way. During all of the COVID craziness, I was deeply connected to my peers, pastors, and friends who were walking through a lot of the same kinds of challenges, and I would hear about like the things that they were dealing with and thinking to myself like, wow, we're not dealing with any of that kind of stuff. Like, we must be doing something really right. And honestly, what began to develop inside of me, at the time I wouldn't have known what to call it, but it was arrogance and pride, actually. Thought we were better than other folks. We were doing a better job. We were navigating the challenges of that difficult time in a way that was more superior than others. But late 2021 changed all of that for me, because in our own church, as we were still trying to regather and figure out what that looked like together, there were tensions and disagreements, anger, behind the scenes, kind of even out in the open, and I began to really be humbled deeply by it. And if I'm honest, I began to really struggle so deeply with it that I would describe it as I was withdrawing for sure internally. And there was a sense in which that was happening externally for me. I was so disoriented by it all. I almost felt like I was having this out-of-body experience. I don't really believe in that, but like it just felt, when I was here at church, it just felt so disconnected. I was thinking about this right before I came out. One of the things that was really difficult was we were at Memorial, that gargantuan sanctuary, and so there, we were all spread out. It just felt so weird, right? For those of you that were around at that time, you remember that. But supremely uncomfortable moment for me. And I think what was happening for me, you can probably resonate with when difficulty and challenges come into your life as well. We have a natural tendency to not respond right for a variety of reasons. Like for me, I felt like it was easier and maybe even better to sort of give in to despair. It was easier for me to wallow in self-pity. It was easier for sure for me to blame others for the circumstances and the things we're walking through together. It was definitely easier to chase temporary solutions. But I think the most dangerous thing about it for me was that it caused me to justify running from God. Like to the very one who could carry me through this difficulty, I instead chose, in many ways, spiritually, emotionally, like to build walls between me and God. But that's true, I think, for us all. We have a tendency to do those kinds of things in response to difficulty, in response to suffering. It's just what we do. I wonder this morning for you if you consider what suffering and difficulty and challenge looks like in your life, if you would agree with me, well, here's what I have found. The very thing that I'm running from, God, is the exact thing that God wants to use to shape me to look more like Him, to shape me to what He's called me to be. In other words, God is up to something within the difficulty. He's up to something in the challenge. We are continuing our series in the book of 1 Samuel this morning. We're kind of on the last leg of it. We're coming towards the last third or so of this book. And as you know, we've been walking through this passage by passage. And today's passage is really interesting to me. I think in the last few weeks, we've really had an opportunity to, from both myself and Trey, we've been able to talk about some things like jealousy and anger and the fear of man and friendship and some of these things that are super helpful to talk about. Today, if you heard Ellen read from the Psalms, today's passage in 1 Samuel, which we didn't read, we're going to get ready to go through here, is it's a different kind of passage to me. It really just tells the story of David continuing to be on the run. And it's really, I think, tempting to look at it and go, well, I don't really see much going on here other than David's running from Saul. But man, there is. There's so much going on, and actually has a lot to do with what we just talked about. So as we walk through 1 Samuel 23 today, I just want to invite you to see one thing, and it's this. God forges our character and conviction in the crucible of the wilderness. God forges. He shapes. He reshapes our character and conviction in the crucible of the wilderness. So if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, keep them open to 1 Samuel 23, and you'll remember that last week we saw Saul. He is absolutely overcome with anger and paranoia and fear, and he is ranting like a madman, and he's thinking like there are these conspiracies that must be going on. He's trying to spin it and make sense of it, and he's just making stuff up. And we saw that in the midst of all of this, a non-Jewish man, an Edomite by the name of Doeg, speaks up, and being the snake that he was, he slithers into this moment to try to get into Saul's good graces, and he begins to report that the high priest Ahimelech has helped David, right? He has received David, he's given him some bread, gives him Goliath's sword, and yet Doeg takes this opportunity and he twists the truth just enough to stoke Saul's wrath, to get Saul worked up. And the result of that was that Saul says, I want you to go to the priests that are in Nob, and I want you to kill them all. 85 of them. But not only that, I actually want you to slaughter the whole city. The men and the women and the children and all of their goods and livestock. But in the midst of that, one of the priests escapes, Abiathar, and he goes to David in our story last week. And he tells David of what's happened in Nob, what Saul has done, what Doeg has done. But with him, he brings something that's very significant. He brings with him to David what was called the ephod, the priestly ephod, which was a symbol that divine guidance would continue under David moving forward. It's no small thing. So that brings us to our passage today. And I want you to look there, if you would, beginning at verse 1 with me. David here is still in the forests of Hereth, which was located in the wilderness of Judah, and he's hiding. This is a common theme we're going to see today. He's waiting. And word reaches him that the Philistines, their greatest enemy, is attacking a city called Keilah, which is also in the wilderness of Judah. Now, Keilah was a border city in Judah, which meant that the attack against them was an attack of aggression against God's covenant people. And the Philistines, you'll notice, there aren't just content with attacking the city, but they're also looting them. They're looting the threshing floors, which were these flat places, usually on a hill or a mountain, where they would separate the kernels and make them ready for food, for a variety of foods. And they were getting into that and looting that. So not only were they threatening the city's security, they were actually threatening their very survival because of the food situation. But notice that David doesn't rush in impulsively, even after he hears this. This is a very important verse to see. He does something that should make us actually pause a moment here. And what does he do? Do you see that in verse 2? He asks God for help. And God answers him. But David's men aren't so sure. If you see that there, they're concerned, right? They're already on the run. They now aren't sure if they want to follow David into battle again. A lot of these soldiers would have been very weary of that. So instead of dismissing their fear, this is very interesting, like this is some leadership stuff here that I like. We see in verse 4 that David seeks God again. I think in part to respect his men, but also to make sure he wanted to know that he knew that God would approve of them going to help the folks in Keilah. And you look there, God assures him of victory again. And that's exactly what happens there. It's a decisive victory against the Philistines. Now look with me there at verse 7. Saul gets wind of David's whereabouts and he thinks he's got him trapped, right? Because Keilah is a city with walls, it's a city with gates, it's a city with bars. But notice what Saul says in verse 7. It's amazing, honestly. He says, this is Saul, okay? God has given him, David, into my hand. Just think about that statement for a moment in light of all that we've talked about with Saul over the last few weeks. The same God that Saul has disobeyed at every turn, whose priest you just heard, like he just slaughtered, is deluded now in believing that God is somehow with him. He is somehow thinking that divine favor is still with him, is on his side, when it's actually his pride and his arrogance and his disobedience are the very things that have put him at odds with God. He's totally deluded at this point. But notice what David is doing here. He doesn't assume that. He doesn't assume the thing that Saul is assuming wrongly. Look there at verse 10. He calls for Abiathar, who we saw again at the end of our story last week, and that was the priest who had escaped, and tells him to bring to him the ephod, the priestly ephod. So now we have this ephod again. It's back in our story, and I'm not going to go too deeply into this again, because if you've been with us, you know what this is all about. But the ephod was like two things, really. It was priestly attire, but it was also this interesting thing that God had ordained, actually way back in Exodus and Leviticus, to seek. It was like an instrument to seek God's will. And this is how it would work. And if this sounds odd to you, it sounded odd to me when I first heard it too. But the priest would place his hand down in the pockets of this ephod and choose a stone. And depending on what stone he pulled out, he would know what God wanted. Now again, that may strike you as very odd. It doesn't sound necessarily like overtly Christian, right, for our ears. But please know that this was, at this time, a divinely prescribed means to seek God's guidance. And so as we look at verses 9 and 11, I think we see the results of what happens in this moment. God reveals something very important to David through the use of the ephod here. And here's what it was. The very people that David was desiring to help, to save, the folks in Keilah, are going to give him up. God says to David, like, these folks that you're getting ready to defend, they're actually going to turn on you. Now, didn't God say back in verse 4 that he would give the Philistines over to David? Has God changed his mind? Like, why is this piece of information in our story today? It almost seems like God's talking out of both sides of his mouth, right? But here's what is happening. I want you to hear this. God is, because he is a gracious God, he responds to the prayers of his people. He is graciously disclosing to a persistent person, a persistent prayer, another detail here, so that David can see the fuller picture. I'm reminded of the persistent widow, right? And it's a little different story there, Luke 18, where the persistent widow is seeking justice, right? And because of her constant appeal, she received what she asked for. Here, David is persistently doubling down on asking the Lord for his will. And God unveils a deeper truth that would save his life, that would spare his life. It's amazing, honestly. And so David then chooses to leave that area and go to what was called the wilderness of Ziph. And it says that Saul gives up his expedition when he hears about this. So David's life is spared. And then notice this really beautiful moment in verses 16 through 18. We have the re-entry of David's dear friend, Jonathan. And this will be the last time that we see Jonathan in our story. Jonathan visits David. Remember, Jonathan is Saul's son. He visits him in the wilderness of Ziph, and it says that he's strengthened through Jonathan's connection with him, because Jonathan does something really neat. He is reminding David of God's promises. That's what a good friend does, right? When you're struggling, a good friend comes along and reminds you of God and his promises. And notice again, they make a covenant again. This is like the third time, I think, in the book here. But this is the last meeting between David and Jonathan. And then just like that, Jonathan is gone. Now look at verse 19, if you would, with me. Here is where David is, right? We said he retreated to the wilderness of Ziph. And the Ziphites, the folks that lived in this area, notice that rather than welcoming David as their protector, they go straight to Saul with David's coordinates. Now earlier, we just said God rescued David before the folks in Keilah betrayed him. But here, the Ziphites actually do rat out David. Now, Saul is still king. Remember this. It's a hollow kingship. He is still king here. David has been secretly anointed many chapters back. But sort of functionally in the nation right now, Saul is still in charge. And so I think we can understand in one sense why the Ziphites rat David out here, because like they know from their perspective it's a big gamble to go with the David guy still. And so their allegiance sort of bends to whichever way the wind of power is blowing right now. And so they decide to join forces with Saul. And it says that they begin to close in on David there in verse 24. And then we have this scene at the very end of our chapter this morning, verses 25 through 28, where they're in what's called the wilderness of Maon. This is another spot that David has retreated to. The Ziphites and Saul are on one side of the mountain, and on the other side of the mountain are David and his mighty men. And look there at the end of verse 26 and into verse 27. Just as Saul is about to pounce, a messenger arrives, comes to Saul and tells Saul, hey, there is a raid going on somewhere in your kingdom. I mean, he was, the king over Judah, so like somewhere in that area. And that causes Saul to abandon in an instant his chase of David. And it says that this place was called, or is called, the Rock of Escape. I love that. This was the place that David barely escaped Saul's pursuit. And I just love that name, the Rock of Escape, right? And once again, how many times have we seen this over the last few weeks? God's providence is in play. And it says at the end of our passage today that David then retreated to the strongholds. Do you see that word? Which next week we'll see. We're going to still continue to be in this particular part of the world. Next week it's going to be described as the wilderness of En-Gedi. At the end of our chapter it just says strongholds. And that's 1 Samuel 23. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things that are woven throughout 1 Samuel 23, and this is really going to kind of mark where we're headed this morning. And the first theme is this one. I wonder if you caught it. It's the theme of betrayal. Right? We see it a couple times specifically in our passage today. Look back at verse 12. Right? The very city that David had just saved from the Philistines was now ready to hand him over. The city of Keilah. They were happy to have David's sword for themselves, but they had no interest in his safety. Now, this was an almost betrayal, right? They didn't go through with it. God saved David from that. But then down in verses 19 and 20, the Ziphites march straight to Saul and say, we know where David is, so we'll hand him over to you if you'll promise us safety and security. No questions asked. And here we see that betrayal actually does happen. We actually kind of see this too, I think, where fear is the currency, loyalty is for sale, right? And in both of these instances, David is surrounded by betrayal, essentially, all around him. And even those he saved turned their backs on him when it was convenient for them. What David is facing here in our chapter today is the harsh reality that betrayal rarely announces itself. It often creeps in very unnoticed. But once it does creep in, it begins to grow, and it threatens to shatter the trust that should exist between people, right? Now, I would argue that there is actually a third kind of betrayal in our story today. It's under the surface. We didn't see it specifically named today, and honestly, it's really something we've seen portrayed throughout the past 6 chapters of 1 Samuel. And it's this: the betrayal, the treachery, the wickedness of Saul towards David. Honestly, Saul is like the one that's animating all of this betrayal, right? That we even see specifically in our passage today. So let's just think about this over the past few chapters. Saul has tried to kill David with a spear multiple times. He's deceptively offered his daughter Merab in marriage, but he gives her to another man instead. He uses his other daughter, Michal, as bait by demanding a price for her that was beyond dangerous. He sent men to David's house to kill him. When that didn't work, he pursued David himself in Naioth to like personally kill him after 3 rounds of henchmen failed to do that. He betrayed David indirectly by massacring the priests of Nob because they had helped David. And in our passage today, Saul partners with the Ziphites to hunt David down like a dog in the wilderness. And in all of these instances, what we see is that Saul's betrayal is not just a single spear being thrown at him, but it is a relentless, obsessive attempt to eradicate David's very existence. That's betrayal. But I want you to notice the context for much of this betrayal that we have seen over these few weeks. And this is the second thing that I want you to see today. Listen to this. David retreats to the cave of Adullam in the wilderness of Judah. He retreats to the forest of Hereth within the wilderness of Ziph. He retreats to the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. He retreats to the mountainous wilderness of Maon. And today, at the end of our passage, he retreats to the wilderness, the strongholds of En-Gedi. Did you catch the thread that's running through this? The setting, the environment in which this betrayal is happening. Yeah, it's the wilderness. Now, this thread of the wilderness runs throughout the Old Testament. If you're familiar with your Old Testament, you know, like Joseph's time in prison is a kind of wilderness of injustice and abandonment. It's a place where his faith in God is tested and refined. Moses flees to the wilderness of Midian. He was a prince, but now he's like a fugitive, right? Herding sheep in obscurity. Israel stumbles through the wilderness for 40 years, caught between their past, thinking the chains of Egypt are more desirable than their promised future. Jonah finds himself in a kind of wilderness when he finds himself in the belly of a fish, a deep, kind of watery wilderness where running from God finally becomes impossible. Even in the latter parts of the Old Testament, the exiles of Babylon, it says that they hung their harps on the willows. And that was like a way of them aching for the home that they had lost. Because they felt they were wandering in this sort of spiritual wilderness of a world that did not know their God. So the wilderness is a place where people are emptied. When we look at the stories of the wilderness in the Bible, it's a place where people are stripped down. It's a place where they're often left facing the raw truth of their own limitations, their own struggles. And when we come across these kinds of stories in the Bible, especially like we've seen the past couple of weeks in the story of David, I want you to listen to this. We are supposed to notice something. And here it is. The wilderness is never just about geography. And this brings me to the one thing I want you to see this morning. God forges our character and conviction in the crucible of the wilderness. Do you hear how that's not about geography first, right? So let's just think about this for a moment in the life of David in 1 Samuel 22 and 23, just the last couple of weeks. David, a man after God's own heart. He trusts in God. We see him depending on God. And yet, here he is in the last few chapters, the rightful king in the desert, in the cave, in the wilderness, in the forest. What's going on here? Well, God never does anything without a purpose, right? So there is a reason, there is an objective, an aim that God has for the wilderness, always. Let me say it this way. If David is in the wilderness, then the wilderness must be a part of God's plan. God is never random. His providence is never wasted, because when God calls a man like David to something great, this is the McDonald quote, I'm reminded of that. He does not send him, listen, untested. And make no mistake, David is being deeply tested now. The palace is coming, yes, but first there must be, listen, must be a wilderness. So in what ways was David's character and conviction being tested in our passage today? Like, what was the purpose? If we can agree that God is up to something, what was he up to? In what way was he testing David? We've said over the past few weeks that we really have this amazing dynamic, interesting dynamic taking place in 1 Samuel, because we actually get to see inside the heart of David in another part of our Bible. Here's what I mean. The drama of 1 Samuel spills into another part of the Scriptures, the Psalms, actually. Found right in the middle of your Bibles. And this is what some of the Psalms are the soundtrack to David's wilderness wanderings. In fact, today, Psalm 54 and 63 are born out of the very moments that we're reading through here in 1 Samuel 23, the Psalms that you heard Ellen read earlier. And these Psalms give us a window into David's heart in real time. And here's why this is so cool to me. Like, the Psalms 54 and 63, aren't just telling us what happened to David, but they're telling us how he wrestled with what was happening to him. How he prayed through it, how he clung to God when everything was stripped away. And I think it's here we see the way that David's character and conviction were being tested, because the Psalms don't just tell the story, they don't just retell the story. It wasn't just something that David walked through. In the Psalms, we get to see that it was something that was working its way through him. The Psalms let us overhear the heart of a man in David who wasn't just surviving, but he was being shaped, reshaped. So you heard Psalm 54 and 63 read earlier. I'm not going to read all of that again, but I want to encourage you to turn first to Psalm 54 if you would. Just kind of keep that open as we talk here. But Here are some of the things. I see a couple of the ways. There's a lot of things you see here probably in Psalm 54, but there's just a couple of things that stand out to me that describe the way in which David is being formed. The first is in verse 1 of Psalm 54. David is expressing deep confidence in something that to us might sound like an odd thing to place your hope in. But he says that he has deep confidence that God's name alone is power. Have you ever thought about that? What does it mean for God's name alone to be power for you? See, David knows that deliverance doesn't come first with a great strategy or even your own strength, but it comes from the very character of God himself. That's what he's expressing here in verse 1. Here's another thing I see in Psalm 54, verse 3. Look there. David, I think, is recognizing that enemies, and we could maybe broaden that out to say like difficulty and challenge and suffering, will rise in the life of a Christian. It is inevitable. But David, notice, doesn't assume that a life free from opposition is what's normal. He assumes a life where God's faithfulness is bigger than all of the difficulty. He actually saying like, God, I know you will sustain me. What would that look like for us to believe that? That's something God is doing in the life of David. Look with me, if you would, turn a few pages over to Psalm 63. I think there's a couple things here we can see how God is working out and shaping and reforming and forging David here in the first couple of verses of Psalm 63. David has a perspective that sees God's presence as his greatest good. You see that? Like even in the difficulty he's walking through, the deep suffering that he's walking through, the betrayal that he's walking through, notice at least here, David is not asking God for comfort. He's asking God for God. And then second, in verse 5 of Psalm 63, I see David he has a resolve to find satisfaction in God, not his circumstances. In other words, David's hope isn't in his situation changing necessarily. Now, he wants it to change. We want that when we're going through difficulty, but like his hope is not in the situation itself changing, but in God being enough even if it doesn't. Are you with me? See, we're not just hearing David's cries in the wilderness here, even in the Psalms. What we're witnessing, listen to this, is the sound of God forging a king in the depths of his despair. God is refining him through the furnace of the wilderness while not removing him from it. So let me ask you, have you ever been in a wilderness? Maybe you feel like you're in one today. Like if you've never been in one, that would surprise me, but know that one is coming. But what do I mean by a wilderness? Well, we could talk about it a few ways. This is not an exhaustive list, but here are some of the most common kinds of what I would call modern day wildernesses that, for kind of where I stand, particularly as I pastor and minister. The first is this one. It's the wilderness of waiting. This would be like a season of stalled hopes where you feel stuck in a barren and unfruitful place and you're wondering if anything will ever change. The wilderness of waiting. Another one is the wilderness of doubt. This is like a place of spiritual or emotional desolation where your faith feels dry, feels unfulfilled. You have questions about God's presence, about his goodness. It's the wilderness of doubt. There's the wilderness of loss. This is a state of grief or mourning where you're navigating the unknown without maybe the things or the people that you once relied on. It's the wilderness of loss. There's the wilderness of loneliness. This is a sense of deep isolation, deep abandonment, like you feel separated from others in a deep way, and maybe even from God. And last, there's the wilderness of fear. It's a place where anxiety and worry cloud your vision so much, the unknown feels so overwhelming that you just want to shut down. The wilderness comes in a variety of shapes, in a variety of sizes, but one thing is certain, and this is why we're talking about this morning. We have a tendency to do what I said I wanted to do at the top of our time this morning. To run from God, to run away from God, to not engage in the way that we should. The wilderness, friends, is one of God's appointed means to test you, but also refine you. If we don't know that, if we can't remember that in the midst of the wilderness will make no sense to us. It'll feel like God is angry at us, frustrated with us. We'll think we've done something to make God angry with us. But in the midst of a wilderness, God offers not necessarily immediate escape, but it's because He's up to something. But know this, in the wilderness, God always offers His presence. So how does God do that? Where can we find hope in the midst of our wilderness? The resources are running dry. You feel like the road ahead is unclear. Your soul is desperate for some kind of relief. Here's the good news, friend, for you this morning. Jesus knows the wilderness. In Matthew 4, in the wilderness of temptation, Jesus resisted the devil with the power of God's word. And that moment in the wilderness wasn't just a test. It was actually a prophetic picture of what was to come, where Jesus would face a far greater trial, the wilderness of the cross. So friend, for you, the wilderness you are in right now, the wilderness that you may encounter in the future, maybe even the wilderness you're trying to make sense of from the past, you still maybe feel like you're wading through. Know this, Jesus has walked through the wilderness of temptation. He's walked through the wilderness of betrayal. He's walked through the wilderness of death itself for you. He was forsaken so that you would never have to be. And because He overcame it all, listen, His promise to be with you in your wilderness is always there. Let me say it another way. When you're in the wilderness, remember that Jesus is not just a way out, He is the way through. When you're in the wilderness, don't settle, like I was tempted to do, for quick fixes or superficial solutions. Don't let the discomfort convince you that God isn't there. Don't try to outrun it. The way through your wilderness is with a faithful companion, Jesus. Jesus makes the wilderness a way to a richer, deeper life in Him. So if you're here this morning and you would say, man, I'm in a wilderness, Brad. I have no hope because I don't know Jesus. And you're telling me that Jesus can give me the hope that I need in the wilderness? Yes, friend, He can. He can do what I just described to you. The work in the person of Christ on the cross for you is your way out of your wilderness, the wilderness of sin. Here in a moment during our time of communion, there are going to be Some folks to my left here that would love to talk with you about what it means to come out of the wilderness of sin and enter into the promised land of freedom and hope and joy and salvation. They would love to talk with you about what that looks like. But let me close with this. As you go through a wilderness with your friend Jesus, don't miss what God is doing in that. Just as he refined David in the desolate places, he is teaching you something. That God doesn't just use the wilderness to test your faith. He uses it to build a faith worth testing. So the next time that you feel lost in the wilderness, again, maybe you feel that way today, like you're in one now. Remember this: God never wastes a wilderness, ever. What may feel like a barren stretch for you right now is actually holy ground for growth. It's a place where he is wanting to reveal his character like he did to David, and we saw that in the Psalms today, right? Where he's strengthening your trust in him. Where he is equipping you for maybe future kingdom work. Where he's growing a deep confidence in his name for you. You may not see it now. We hardly really ever do in the wilderness. It's hard for us to have this kind of vision. But know this: when you are in a wilderness, God never wastes that, and know that it's not meant to destroy you. It's meant to make you different. It's not meant to break you. It's actually meant to build you. It's not to bury you, but to bury the things that maybe need to die in your life. So remember, friend, every wilderness has a purpose in God's plan. God can turn every wilderness, if we'll let him, into a classroom of his grace. That's what forges character. That's what forges conviction. God never wastes a wilderness. Let's pray together.